Good day, everybody, wherever you are tuning in around this webinar today, and welcome to another of our favorites from Portland in our July IAP2 Learning webinar. I'm Drew Snyder, filling in for Amelia Shaw. Amelia is in Calgary today, training future P2 professionals or P2 professionals who need to get a refresher. And so you're stuck with me this time around. Today, we present another favorite from Portland. Kelly Spitzley in her presentation, It's Geek to Me, which was one of the higher rated sessions among the people who came to the conference last September. This session is being recorded, so for your professional development use, you're going to be able to access it. Also, Kelly has very kindly agreed to share some of her collateral material with us. So we'll post that online as well. That's usually posted to within 24 hours of the end of the session. Couple of housekeeping things. We encourage you to take part in this, and this is an interactive session. Kelly has got a couple of questions or little tests that she's going to be throwing in from time to time. You see we have a question box. You can type your questions into that, and they will also be your comments, your responses to Kelly's question. Also, if you have a question of your own, there's a couple of ways of asking that question. You can type it into the box, or there's a little yellow hand icon on your screen there. Just click that and I'll see your hand go up, and when it's appropriate, I'll ask you to ask the question directly through your microphone. Speaking of microphones, I've got you all muted, so if you have muted your mic, please unmute it, and that way we'll come to you when it's your turn to talk, if you want to talk, of course, and otherwise we've got control over that. We encourage you all to take part in this. As I say, Kelly's got some questions she'll be firing at you. Before we get onto that, though, I'd like to mention a couple of things coming up, and that is a plug for the IAP2 North American Conference, which is happening in Montreal, September 28th to the 30th. Got some great keynote speakers coming up. J.P. Gladue, the President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, and Dickie Choyang, part of the first Central Tibetan Authority. She'll be talking about the trip from theocracy to democracy in a country that's been occupied by China for about a half a century. So please follow our hashtag on Twitter and Facebook and social media. It is IAP, the number 2, MTL16. And remember, too, the early bird deadline is coming up. It's June 30th. And after that, the prices go up a bit. So if you haven't registered yet, now is a great time to do that while the prices are still at their early bird levels. So let's get on with today's webinar and meet our presenter, Kelly Spitzley. She is the graphic, web, and database design specialist with HDR Engineering in Minneapolis. She designs visual communication materials, including informational and data-driven graphics, websites, and maps for a variety of power, transportation, and water projects around the country. And she loves making communication materials that are engaging, understandable, and memorable to help stakeholders truly understand the project and its impacts. And through this, Kelly developed her presentation, It's Geek to Me, which is all about taking the techno-speak of the planners and engineers and all about turning it into plain English. Kelly, welcome to the webinar. Thank you for being part of it today.
Thank you. That was by far the most professional sounding introduction I've ever had.
Oh, well.
So I appreciate it.
Well, you know, it helps when you pull it off the website. They're the pros.
Yeah, you have a great voice for doing this, so thank you. I want to just thank everyone for taking time out of their day to log in and listen to this session. I'm talking today about something that is both a personal and professional passion of mine, and that is using information design to break down the technical language barrier. And at its heart, that's really about the process of, and I think...
I have just handed you the column.
Can you see my screen yet?
Not yet.
Not yet, probably. And just let me know when we're ready here.
You're on.
Okay, awesome. So I'm talking about using information design to break down the technical language barrier, which really is about the process of seeing and understanding something. And that's a process that takes place right there in the very humble-looking human brain. Although it seems really simple to say, there are a lot of incredible things that happen between when you see something and when you make sense of it. And visual design really sits right in the middle of those two things, kind of like a bridge between them. When you use visual design to communicate meaning, you're really sitting right at the sweet spot where form intersects function, or more simply put, where brain meets beauty. What you see visualized on the screen before you is a map of the brain's white matter, which is basically the brain's communications infrastructure, like its fiber optic cable. It's how the parts of the brain that help you see something or hear, smell, or taste something talk to the parts of your brain that help you make sense of it. What's pretty amazing about white matter is in that in each of your brains, which are roughly about 3 pounds, so if you picture holding a medium-sized cantaloupe in your hands, there's 100,000 miles of this white matter somehow crammed in there. That's enough to circle the Earth 4 times over if you stretch it out. And when you consider that that's all alongside 86 billion neurons, 150 trillion synapses, and of course all the fat, water, and protein that make up the structure of the brain itself, you begin to realize that each of us is equipped with arguably the most sophisticated, densely packed piece of biological architecture in the known universe, which is really cool. And today I'm going to focus on one part in particular of this powerful machine that we all have. It sits right at the back of your skull, and it's called the visual cortex. It's responsible for taking in information from your eyes and down the optic nerve and then kicking it out to the rest of your brain for processing. And since we're talking today about design, this visual processing center that we all have becomes pretty important. And as it turns out, our sense of sight is by far the fastest of our 5 senses. It's 10 times faster than touch, 100 times faster than sound or smell, and 1,000 times faster than taste. So if you consider that our senses are really just data input methods, they're how we experience the world around us, then our sense of sight becomes the most efficient data input method that we have. So because of this, I kind of wanted to put it to the test today. And this is the part where some interactivity kind of plays in. I have done this presentation in person before, so this may be a little bit tricky over a screen share, but if you could just bear with me. If it doesn't work, I'll just explain, what normally happens. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to flash an image at you on the screen, and after I flash the image, I'm hoping that everyone who feels fairly confident that they could tell me what was in that image to type out the thing that they saw. So we'll give this a shot, and Drew, you'll be my sort of test, so if you could tell me if nothing showed up, okay, just let me know. But otherwise, if you do see something, I'll just pause to give people a chance to type in their answers just for a little bit, not too long, and then we'll move forward. So if everybody could just make sure that they're looking at the screen. You should have seen something.
Okay, I got one no, and in fact you can make it 2 no's because I didn't see it either.
Okay,
but I don't count.
We'll try it one more
White
time.
screen, didn't see anything, didn't see it. Okay, hang on, folks, and let's try it again.
Okay, there's going to just be.
Okay, what did you see, folks?
And I don't know if I can actually see.
Well, that's funny.
Answers.
We've got one person who's 2 people who say they saw something, others who say they still saw nothing.
Okay, it probably all depends on connection speed. So let's just focus on the ones that did see something.
Right. Okay, one says that she saw green grass.
Okay.
And another says that she saw a cow.
Okay. That is correct. Thank you to both of those answers. There's a cow standing in a field of green grass. So what's interesting, and typically I should say when this is done in person and there isn't a connection speed issue, pretty much everybody in the audience immediately sees a cow and there's kind of no question about it. So that's what is supposed to happen. So I'm glad at least 2 of you got to participate in the real sense. So what's kind of interesting is that I flashed that image at a rate of 20 milliseconds, and that's because it's as fast as I could get PowerPoint to go. But your brain could have actually interpreted that image in as few as 13 milliseconds, so 7 milliseconds faster than what we saw on the screen. So at this point, I try to up the challenge level a little bit because I am going a little bit easy on everyone. Now this might be extra challenging over a screen share, but we'll just give it one shot and see what happens. Because seeing the cow was so easy for everyone, I'm going to flash a series of images and we'll see if anyone can get them all. Did anyone see that?
Okay, let's see what we get up there. Couple saying nope, nothing. Now I clearly saw something on there,
Okay.
and it's
Well, Drew, maybe you're my test case.
or a case of some sort. Okay. Dawn saw a banana and an apple. Amy saw a banana and an apple. Dawn Green,
Okay.
you win. So does Amy Buchler.
Okay, so I think probably not all of them went through, which is fine. And I promise this is the only part of this presentation that's going to rely on screen
Okay.
quickness. But what happened is I flashed 4 images, and the apple and the banana were one of them. There was also a train and a house and Homer Simpson freaking out in his nuclear plant. And typically people get 3 of 4 or all 4 of 4 of those images. So what's happening is people are able to process these images extremely quickly. And at this point, then I kind of pivot and I ask, what about text? Because text is also a visual component. Can we process text visually as fast as we can process images? So at this point, I ask a question, and the question is, what color is in the dog's sweater? And then I'm going to flash the answer on the screen. And we can try one more time. Drew, did you happen to see something?
I saw text come up. I could probably
Okay.
identify a couple of the words there.
Okay. Yep, that's about what average, what happens on average. So at this point, we'll just give it one more try. So what happened is I flashed the text a couple of times to give people a chance to try to process it. Typically they can work out a word or two of the text. There's probably about 8 to 10 words of text. The third time I flashed the image that actually answers the question. So it's a dog wearing a sweater that contains the colors red, yellow, and blue. And so the purpose of this is to point out that although your brain was able to process that single image extremely quickly and very accurately, and even process multiple different images back to back quickly, you weren't able to process the text, which kind of brings up a really interesting question, and that is why can't your brain process the text, which is also visual, but can process the images? And the answer to that question really lies in the journey that that information takes in your brain once it hits your visual cortex and then gets booted out to the rest of the brain for processing. So when your brain sees an image, it's really just seeing color, shape, and spatial arrangement. There's only like one layer of abstraction between the visual representation of the cow and the cow itself. So that journey that the information takes in your brain is actually pretty straightforward, and it stays pretty localized to the visual cortex. On the other hand, text is a totally different animal. So yes, it's visual because you can see the characters on the screen, but those characters actually represent individual sounds called phonemes, and your brain has to string those phonemes together to form a word, and then string the words together to form a sentence, and then finally attach meaning. So right off the bat, we're going outside of the visual area of your brain and into some of the auditory parts of your brain. And what's also interesting is that your brain pulls in parts of your motor cortex associated with the muscle memory of writing those words out, and also starting to make plans to physically vocalize those words. And that's because when we were learning to read, we were also learning to write, and saying things out loud and was pretty integral to that whole process. So the journey that the information takes through your brain with text is much less localized to the visual cortex, and it's less straightforward. It kind of gets bounced around your brain like a pinball, and because of that, it just takes longer. Now, I'm a big book nerd, so none of this is to diminish the power of the written word in any way. When we humans figured out that we could permanently record complex concepts around 5,200 years ago, it totally changed the course of human history. But human history extends far longer than 5,200 years ago, and for a large part of our existence as a species, our ability to almost instantaneously interpret and react to color, shape, and spatial arrangement was pretty critical to our survival. So this visual fast lane that we all have built into our brains is really just a matter of biology. It's by necessity that we're all visual processing experts. But I don't want us to get too cocky because we do have our limitations. Now this exercise will be much easier than the first one, and I think we're going to be able to use the voting or the hands for this exercise, so if you could locate
Okay.
those. What I have up on the screen now are two panels, a black panel and a white panel, and in those two panels there are a number of colored dots, as you can see. And every color of dot between those two panels is different except one. One color of dot is the same between those two panels. And I want to see if we can identify which color of dot is the same between the two. And I'm even going to make it easy. I'm going to narrow it down to 3. So by show of hands, or hand icon, whatever, who thinks that the red dot is the same color of red between the black and the white panel?
Okay, waiting for hands to go up here. Ah, let me see. We've got,
People might not think it's the red one.
well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 say that the red dot on the white panel is the same color as the red dot on the black panel.
Okay, and how about the green dot?
Okay, just a second. I'm going to knock down all the hands. Okay, let's try it again. Put up your hands, those who think that the green dot on the white panel is the same as the green dot on the black. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Okay, and then finally, how about the gray dot?
Okay, is the gray dot on the white panel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,
Okay.
9, 10? Yeah, a lot of people voted for that gray dot.
Okay, so let's reveal the answers. Those of you who said red, I'm sorry. Same to those of you who said green, and we actually had a pretty good showing for the gray dot, which means that everybody on this phone call, or most people, are above average. But a lot of people, typically this is split. It's very difficult for people to tell the difference with the equipment that we have in our eyes and our brain. So basically, what does this tell us? It tells us that context is everything. And I want you to hold that thought in your mind, and I want to also take a step back and talk about that technical language barrier that I've been referencing, which I'm going to call a communications barrier from here on out. So on one side of the communication barrier, we have the project team. So that's the project manager, the staff, any consultants that may be involved. And on the other side of that project or communication barrier is pretty much everyone else. So what this can do a lot of times is set up an us versus them divide. And on some projects it might even become a reasonable versus unreasonable divide. And every so often on a particularly frustrating project, which I'm sure we've all been a part of, there can be even a smart versus dumb. But I want to talk about who this everyone else group is. It's your project community, so the people that are impacted either directly or indirectly by your project. It's the media, the people who are responsible for putting information out into the world about your project. It's community and political leaders, the ones who drive policy and make decisions, and sometimes it might even be you. And I mean that as in you personally, because we can't all be expected to know everything about our projects. They're complicated and multifaceted. But I also mean you as in perhaps your client, if you're a consultant, because they did hire you for a reason. They may not be the expert. Or if you're the working on the project team as part of the organization that owns it, it might be your boss or your boss's boss, somebody up the chain who may not technically understand the project on the level that you do. So with that in mind, let's frame this differently. Instead of a divide, I'd rather think of it as more of a gradient between having more context and having less context. So the project team really lives inside this project bubble. They know all the technical details, the nuances, day-to-day communications about the project. They hold all the context, which means they really hold all the power in the situation. So it's the project team's responsibility to communicate that context to the people that their project affects on the other side of that barrier. If someone on the other side of that barrier doesn't understand something about your project, it shouldn't be considered a reflection of their intelligence or their ability to reason. It should be considered a reflection of a failure on the part of the project team to communicate that information in a way that was clear, understandable, and engaging. And I've seen this failure happen in a few different ways. And I've been in the industry for about 10 years now, and so just kind of looking back on the different ways I've seen some things kind of flop in terms of communication. I've seen that sometimes we remove as many specifics as we possibly can and kind of gloss it over, almost out of fear that if we give them too much information, something bad will happen. I've also seen us underestimate the intelligence of our audience and oversimplify the information or dumb it down. And probably more often than not, we don't do much of anything at all to clarify the information, and we just kind of shove it through at them. But today I want to talk about a different approach to breaching that communication barrier. Let's change our perspective, let's add context, and design a new way through. So how do we change our perspective? Well, one obvious way is to just simply change our viewing angle. Well, this may seem obvious, the results can be really significant. Here we have a map of all the hurricanes that have occurred from 1851 to the present. And from this map we can see clusters of where hurricanes occur in the world, that they generally move from west to east, and that they gather their peak intensity in the middle of their storm path and then kind of taper off again. And that's really about it. But simply by changing the viewing angle of this same data, in this case to a polar projection or from the bottom up, a whole new story emerges. First, it becomes much more visually compelling. It's like we're looking into this swirling vortex or the eye of a storm. Second, while on the standard map the clusters of hurricane activity looked kind of like isolated hotspots, this map from its circular continuity shows us that there's a flow between all of these hurricanes, and it reminds us that weather events are all connected to each other around the globe. And finally, my favorite part is that we start to learn something about the character of a hurricane. So this yellow line, this yellow dotted dashed circle in the middle represents the equator. And we can see that hurricanes hate the equator. They basically fling themselves away from the warm waters where they're born toward the colder waters where they die off. It becomes this kind of meteorological coming-of-age story. And all of this comes from simply changing the angle that we looked at that very same data. We can also take a closer look. Here we have the standard wind map, and it shows the average wind speeds around the country. But say we don't want to just see wind speed. We want to see wind direction too. And we don't want just average values. We want real-time data. And so just by stepping in for a closer look at this data, we end up with one of my favorite data visualizations, this truly hypnotic map showing wind speed and direction around the country in real time. I have definitely stared at this way longer than I should have, but you can click around, you can zoom in on your area, and there's even a gallery where you can go back in time to major wind events and take a look. This is Hurricane Sandy in 2012. Take a look at what that looked like. So very, very cool by taking a step closer to that data. We can also take a step back and see things in a broader context. Here we have today, a standard calendar with today marked, which really shows us this is kind of the standard way of visualizing the concept of today, this 24-hour period as most people understand it. And today kind of feels like a big deal to all of us because we're right in the middle of it. It's going to last 24 whole hours. We have tons of stuff to do. It doesn't feel like we have enough time to do it, and it's the usual story. But what if we were to take a giant cosmic step backwards? This simple website does something really cool. It puts the idea of today in a much, much, much broader perspective. And it really takes a simple approach by using a kind of simple motion and colored rectangles to put today against an increasingly broader context. We're going basically all the way back to the beginning of time, essentially. And then we start to move forward through major events on our planet, fish, insects, human life, etc. And just watching this kind of as it goes forward makes you feel less and less significant. And then by the end you realize today is really not significant at all, which is kind of a good perspective to have if you're having one of those days. You can also combine different ways of looking at something. Here we have a video of a hummingbird flying in slow motion. Now, each of us, given our different backgrounds, our education, our experiences and interests, might see something different when we see this. But if you're anything like me, I just see a really cool video of a hummingbird flying in slow motion. That's about it. But one of my favorite designers out in the world, Eleanor Lutz, who happens to have an advanced degree in molecular biology and this very unique experience breaking down video footage for lab experiments, saw this. Nope, that's not what she saw. I'm not sure why. That's a bummer. That's never happened before, but what it's supposed to show is a really beautiful visualization of the wing beats of 5 different species mapped out in a geometric pattern. I wish you could see it because it's one of my favorite things that I've ever seen someone do, and it's an animated infographic that shows those geometric patterns of 5 different species. One of them is the hummingbird, and you can see the difference in their wing beats so clearly because of that geometric pattern. It's very cool, and I don't think that anyone else besides this particular person could have put that particular graphic together, and it shows just the power of combining different perspectives together to get a new take on something. And finally, the most powerful way, in my opinion, I think especially in this industry, to change our perspective, and it's a great way to get outside that project bubble, is to see the world through someone else's eyes. So one of my favorite examples of how successful this can be is something that impacts every one of us every day. And if you're old enough, you'll maybe remember this. This is what computers looked like in the late 70s and early 80s. In order to make this computer do something, you had to type a command or a series of commands into command prompt, and then it would execute. And this was fine if you were a computer programmer or a research scientist. In fact, you have a lot of power and control with this interface, and as a web developer, I still use command prompt all the time. But if you're a company looking to place your computer into the average home, this is definitely not an acceptable way to expect normal people to complete daily tasks. So in the early 80s, 3 companies went through this exercise of asking themselves, how would a normal person organize their files? And how would a normal person delete a file or create a file? And this process led to the very beginnings of something that we all use every day, the visual operating system, or the GUI, the graphical user interface. So this is Macintosh's first iteration of the graphical user interface. But all 3 companies came up with a very similar concept in the end. And what we can see is a very deliberate visual desktop metaphor, like file folders, trash cans, a hand writing out letters, to help people connect the old way of doing things with the new way. And this is such a successful approach that even 2 decades later, we still have basically the same concept in place, although it's a little bit prettier. It's just a little pop quiz. I mentioned that there were 3 companies that went through this process. I gave one away, Macintosh, and I'm sure we can all probably guess that Microsoft was the other one, but does anyone happen to know who that 3rd company is?
Okay, let's see how many people are on there. Commodore, asks Kyra.
Ooh.
HP,
no,
that's Carla.
Okay.
Let's see who else we got. It says not Commodore, not HP.
We'll wait for a 3rd one.
IBM. We've got 2. Not IBM either.
No. They're all really good.
I'm going to add, hang on, TI. Aaron asks, was it TI, Texas Instruments?
Oh, Texas Instruments. Nope, it was not. It was actually Xerox. And what's interesting is Xerox, right? I know, it sounds so dated now. They actually beat the other 2 companies to the punch, but unfortunately for them, their computers were more expensive and slower than Macintoshes were, so they kind of lost out on the great OS battle, I guess. So kind of interesting. So moving forward, how do we add context? So context is all about setting the stage. So if you're telling a story, it's about where the story is set, when it's set, what characters you include, what they're wearing, etc., how they talk to each other. But with visual design, it's all about our old friends, color, shape, and spatial arrangement that we talked about earlier. It's the same elements that help our visual cortex interpret what we see. So just to illustrate how powerful context can be in using visual design, adding context to a piece of information, it's like a secret weapon. I'm going to walk through a process of adding context. And we'll start with just a very raw piece of information, a number, 11,419. And we're really starting from scratch. We have no context whatsoever. So we have no idea if this is a big number or a small number, a good number or a bad number. So let's add a little bit more context. Okay, so now we know this is a very bad number, and especially in light of this weekend's tragedy, which I made this presentation before, this is a very, very sad number. So let's talk about what we want to do about this number. And let's pretend that we're gun safety advocates and we're a group that's interested in promoting responsible gun ownership. And so in order to do that, we want people to really feel something when they see this number, enough to hopefully change their irresponsible behavior or continue to promote good behavior. It's a really heavy subject and it's a very tall order for one graphic, but let's walk through a process and see how adding context to this can really powerfully promote this idea. So we have an image of a gun and some very scary dramatic red font, and it adds an instant visual recognition to this number, and it also adds an element of fear and gravity. But for me, it doesn't connect me to the victims in any way. It just makes me really scared of guns, like this one. So let's change gears a little bit. Okay, so we've added silhouettes of people and we've made it stylized and trendy. There's a target in the background and a very stark silhouette of a handgun to kind of add that visual recognition again. It tells a little bit more of a story. It incorporates the fact that people are involved in this, but it still doesn't elicit any emotion in me. It just kind of reminds me of an opening to a Bond movie, and that's not really what we're going for. Let's try giving these people a face. So this is a little less abstract. These are real people in the background, and it's more effective because we really do respond to looking at faces because it makes us think about our families and our friends. But these faces are a little bit tiny, and I have seen this kind of graphic a lot, so it isn't as memorable because it is something that I've seen sort of repeatedly. Even when we add a little bit of motion, it's still much more powerful than the first two, but less memorable than I want. I want this to really stick with people. So let's end on this. This is a simple motion graphic that shows an arc for every person that was killed from a gunshot wound in 2013. The first part of the arc is yellow, representing the years that they lived, and the second part is gray, which represents the years that they could have lived had they not been killed. It starts out slow, pointing out individual names and ages of the victims, but then it suddenly kicks into gear, and after a moment you start thinking, how big is this number going to get? This graphic really effectively uses time and motion to build up the drama and the sticker shock of that big number, but it also maintains the individuality of the victims by starting off slow at the beginning. This graphic also employs some really nice, subtle visual metaphors. So we saw some really overt visual metaphors in the Macintosh operating system we looked at earlier, but these are a lot more underlying. The arc shape reminds me of a shooting star or something that rises and falls. This luminescent yellow at the beginning of the arc reminds me of a light or a flame or the bright potential of life. The faded gray color at the end of the arc is ghostly. It's kind of sad and lingering and haunting. And the whole color scheme is really somber and mournful, but we have this bright splash of yellow by the end of it, which is kind of a celebration of their lives. It also pulls in a little bit of supplementary data up in the upper right-hand corner. The end number ends up being 502,025 stolen years. So this is a nice way of reminding us that these aren't just random people somewhere in the U.S. at some point in 2013, that these were people with dreams and goals and potential that was cut short or stolen from them. So overall, in my opinion, this graphic connects me emotionally with the victims while still maintaining that sort of shock value of the big number, all while being respectful to the victims that it's illustrating, which is extremely important with a subject like this. So this is a great way to kind of use context to build up a story around a piece of data, and I think that the people who created this graphic did a truly beautiful job. Finally, how do we design a new way through? I want to talk about the word design for a second. I think of design as the process of creating a unique experience, which is a really broad definition, and I did that on purpose because I think everyone in this industry in some way is a designer, even if it's not explicitly in your title. So whether you're creating bridges or power lines or developing maps or documents or social media posts or whatever it is that you're doing, you're still creating something that's meant to be experienced by another person, and you bring your own spin to it. So you can give two different designers the same raw materials, tools, parameters, and goals and end up with two totally different experiences. So what I just flashed before you was a more standard H-frame transmission line that we've all seen before, and then this kind of cool concept, I believe it's out of Iceland, of a transmission line that's shaped like people, as if these giant people are walking across the landscape. Now I realize that those two scenarios involve a few more differences, namely money and reality, but it just goes to show, to illustrate that different groups of people, different teams working on the same project can come up with a very different results, which points to our own unique spin that we put on anything that we do. And so because of that, because we each offer our own spin and our unique blend of education and interest and experience, it each means that we're each irreplaceable, because the way that we do the things that we do cannot be exactly replicated. It's impossible. So I'm going to go walk through a couple examples of some irreplaceable designers whose names you may not know, but whose work absolutely impacts every one of us. So this is the first draft of something that we're all familiar with. Does anyone want to guess and tell me what they think this eventually becomes? I'll just give it a minute, because this is pretty tough at this stage. Okay, here's the second draft. How about now? Does anyone have any guesses? No, really. This eventually becomes, this is the third draft.
We got a whole bunch of people on that second shot who caught that as periodic
good.
elements.
Okay, good. I was like, usually somebody gets that. So good for you guys. You guys are knowledgeable in your chemistry history, I guess. So this, yes, it becomes a periodic table, and this is a process that was started by a Russian chemist in the late 1860s named Dmitry Mendeleev. And I really like to talk about the periodic table for a few different reasons. First, for Mendeleev, this wasn't just a process of beautification or making the information easier to read, although it did do that. For Mendeleev, this was a process of discovery. He realized as he was going through this exercise of organizing the information visually that he could not only predict the existence of elements that hadn't yet been discovered, but also some of their specific properties like atomic weight, just by where they would have fallen in the table he was creating. So this is an excellent example of how form and function don't have to be two separate things. Now, another reason I really like the periodic table is that although Mendeleev gets a lot of the credit for creating the periodic table, as he should, he really started off the process and built up the foundation for it, what you see on the screen is actually where the process ended for him. And it wasn't until about 7 decades later that an American chemist named Glenn Seaborg picked up where Mendeleev left off and created the periodic table as we know it today. So this is a great example of building on or off of or being inspired by other people's work. And it's a personal motto of mine, is always watch what other people are doing out in the industry. And if I don't do that, I find that I become stagnant. I don't grow and improve. And 60 years later, Glenn Seaborg's table still stands, although it's prettier and it's more populated with more elements. In fact, it recently got more populated, I believe, by I think 4 or 5 more elements, all starting with U, which is pretty cool. It's a design that's so fundamental and has been around for so long that most of us don't even realize it's an example of information design at all. But without this table, with this information would be displayed in just a big list, and the average person looking at a big list of this information wouldn't know that groups of elements have common properties or that there's a predictable order to the way elements are constructed. And finally, the last reason I really like to talk about the periodic table is that it illustrates something that is my favorite truth about the design process, and that's that it's never over. You can always do something differently, and you can always do something better. So if you Google alternative periodic tables, you'll get a dozen or so creative ways of showing this same information. And this is one of my favorite alternatives. It was published just a few years after Glenn Seaborg published his table originally. It's based off of a spiral format which shows the continuity between elements, but it also highlights their interrelationships. Plus it's really pretty. I would hang this on my wall and pretend that I know a lot more about chemistry than I really do. So we've looked at mapping conceptual relationships with chemistry, which is what the periodic table is really doing. Let's take a look at spatial relationships. So if you were a visitor or a commuter in London in 1927, this is the map you would have used to navigate the London Underground subway system. And as you can see, it's not particularly legible. And at the time, the Underground management was receiving a lot of complaints from the public about the usability of this map. They knew that their system was growing really fast and that the problem was only going to get worse. At this point, enter Harry Beck, who is an electrical draftsman with this passion for design and artistry, who used his experience in looking at electrical circuit diagrams day in and day out to create this version of the map. He understood that by removing about 80% of the topography and geolocation and instead focusing more on direction and connection, he could untangle that map and make it much easier to use. Looking at this now, you might, well, duh, of course this is better, but when Harry submitted this to the Underground management, they immediately rejected it as way too radical, and it wasn't even until a couple of years later, after continuing to receive complaints, that they finally released this version of the map, albeit with a little note hesitantly asking the public for comment. And as it turned out, the public loved it because it's a lot more legible. And now Harry Beck's map is basically the template for mass transit maps all over the world. This is the current London 2015 transit map, still based off of that same concept, although quite a bit cleaner and also busier. Now, a side note about Harry Beck, he was paid a little over £5 for his work on the map, which if you run it through the exchange rate today and adjust it for inflation, it's about $155. So the London Underground got a very good deal off of this. So I've talked about conceptual relationships and spatial relationships, but how about temporal relationships or relationships in time? So what we see on the screen now is the very first published graphical representation of time. It's created by a scientist and a theologian named Joseph Priestley in 1765, and it shows the various lifespans of influential people from 700 BC to 50 AD, people like Aristotle, Alexander the Great, and Caesar, and how their lives overlapped. So while the idea that you can visualize spans of time seems like a pretty decent concept in itself, a pretty good legacy to have, Joseph Priestley is a lot more well known for a couple of other discoveries. He discovered something called dephlogisticated air, which I had to do a lot of Googling to figure out was just oxygen. Don't know why he called it that, but he did. And he also discovered something that he called water impregnated with fixed air, and which actually is just soda water, and he failed to capitalize on it. J.J. Schwepp actually was the first one to make a lot of money off of that, and my personal theory is that Joseph Priestley just didn't know how to name things in a snappy manner, and so he kind of missed out on all this stuff because nobody knows his name. And he also founded Unitarianism in his spare time. So given all this, the fact that he created a visual representation of time is probably like the lowest thing on the cool list of things that he's done. But to me, it's my favorite thing because it's in my field. So it's really cool to see. And just like the periodic table, the design process never stops. And of course, designers have taken this idea that you could visualize time and done very cool things with it, like this Mission to Mars timeline, which shows all the different missions to Mars, the ownership, the country that initiated it, and how far they made it, or how close to Mars I guess they made it, which is probably a measure of their success. I believe from the 60s to the present, or even to the future. So this shows that that design process is continuing to evolve as well, and I really like that graphic. So finally, we've seen time, space, and concept relationships, but what about quantitative? So you're probably, well, I know you're all familiar with these. These charts and graphs are everywhere now. They seem so obvious and so basic. It's like they've always been there, but if you had a whole bunch of data before 1786, it was displayed in either a big long list or a big long table. At least until a Scottish engineer and economist named William Playfair came along. And Playfair understood that while big long data tables and lists were great for mapping out individual data points, they were really terrible for sensing patterns and trends. So in 1786 he published the very first true statistical time series line graph showing imports and exports to and from England. He also had the first bar chart and the first pie chart in this very same publication. So you might think that everyone saw these visualizations in 1786 and their minds were just blown and there were charts and graphs everywhere after that. but unfortunately for Mr. Playfair, he had a bit of a reputation as a scoundrel and a surprisingly unsuccessful businessman for clearly being as intelligent as he was. And at one point he attempted to blackmail an English lord, and I guess it didn't go very well for him, so he was kind of a joke at the time. Nobody took him seriously. So it wasn't until about 100 years after his death that these kinds of data visualizations caught fire and became widely used. My favorite sort of iteration of the traditional time series statistical line graph is a visualization that some of you may have seen before. It's the genealogy of pop rock music, and it shows the evolution of the record industry from the 1950s, I believe, all the way through the 1980s. And what you see here, which I know is really hard to see on your screen, but I would, if you like music, write the title of this down and Google it because it's really cool. It shows the genesis of the record industry and then its growth in the volume of record sales. But not only that, it shows how different genres were created and bled into subgenres and related genres, and it also maps out the careers of individual artists, how they influenced other artists and how long their careers lasted. It's something you can stare at for quite some time if you're into music, because it's really fun to kind of pick out your favorite artists and see who they influence and how long their careers were mapped out to be measurable and all of that. So what's kind of cool about looking at a lot of these visualizations is that at a certain point you start to realize that data visualizations and art are kind of blended together. There becomes this sort of blurry line at a certain point. So I'd like to play just a little Guess What This Is game to kind of throw out a few of my favorite maybe more obscure graphic design visualizations and see if anyone can guess what they are. So does anyone have a guess as to what this might visualize?
Okay, we're opening this up for others to put in their suggestions. And so far, it's crickets. There's a resounding silence out there. Anybody with any suggestions? I have no idea, and you actually showed me this before. I have no idea what that is.
I still can't remember.
No, oh, hang on.
It's not easy.
Carla.
Oh, we got one.
Yeah, Kyra suggests it's music. Carla suggests dance moves. Gina says something with music vibration.
Okay, those were three of the most accurate guesses I've ever gotten on this, so congratulations. Most people just say smoke and move on. It is music. It is actually maps out the complexity, the musical complexity of the final movements of 5 famous symphonies. And what's really cool about this graphic is it not only shows sort of those lines represent I guess the life cycle of each note. It maps out the actual physical arrangement of the orchestra. So the note goes from where the person who's playing the instrument is seated in the orchestra all the way to the conductor, which is why you get that sort of nested look like that. So it's both a map of the complexity of the music and a map of the orchestra all at the same time. So, and it's just really cool to look at. It's very intriguing. How about this one? Any guesses for this one?
Okay, let's see, what have we got? Carla suggests it's a river. We're actually seeing the same hands out there, folks. Anybody else's suggestions? Kyra, mountaintop. Morgan, river. Anybody else? Anyone gets this right, they can stay and clean the erasers afterwards.
Doesn't sound like incentive. We've got 2 right answers. It's actually LiDAR data.
Life in school. Lightning.
Lightning, that's lightning. Cool.
Yeah.
It's LiDAR data showing the Willamette River in Oregon. And what's cool about this graphic is, well, a lot of people think it's smoke, actually, and it's of course visually very beautiful. But when you look at it from the perspective of it being LiDAR data, you realize you're looking at the whole life history of this river and the surrounding habitat or the surrounding environment. So it shows how the river itself has shifted. And it also shows how the river has impacted the land around it. So pretty cool graphic there. And finally, how about this one? This is the last one.
Okay, who do we have here with this one? And this one I haven't seen, so I'll be absolutely no help at all to anybody. Okay, Carla sees stars.
Oh, okay.
Sound or sound waves, that's from Angie.
Oh, that's a cool one. Okay.
And that appears to be all we've got for
That's because no one ever knows this one. Those are both great guesses and, again, very logical guesses. But what this actually shows is all of the interrelationships in the Bible. So all of those colored lines show some sort of cross-reference from one part of the Bible to the other. And this really isn't intended to zoom in and look at every little verse and see what it's connected to. It's more as a step back and see a snapshot to just show how interrelated it is. And it's also just really beautiful to see. And this is a type of visualization that could be employed on any, kind of piece of information that has a lot of different cross-references to show how connected something is. So a lot of people say it's the Northern Lights, which is, to me, what it looks like, and it's one of my favorites out there as well. So I've shown a lot of outside examples out in the world of some of my favorite things that I've seen, favorite designers, but of course we all want to know how can we do this at our organization. So I'm going to walk through 4 key points or 4 key ways to kind of bring in this kind of visualization into your own projects. Well, the first is you have to find potential communication opportunities. So what's great is we have more opportunities today than at any other point in our history to communicate. We have more channels to reach people, and we have more mediums to work with than ever. It's really up to communication professionals to identify, to justify, and to persuade project managers or clients and technical staff too to take these opportunities and engage the project communities and use them to make their project more measurably successful. And that is really kind of the crux, I think, of, I work within a strategic communications group here at HDR in Minneapolis, and that's really kind of where we have taken off, is being able to measure the success of our different uses of visual communication and selling them back to the client, not because it benefits us, but because it just clearly benefits the project. So you've got to be able to identify those opportunities and take hold of them and bring your project team along with you. Second, form a true partnership with your designer. So the secret to a good working partnership is the exact same secret to a good relationship or a friendship, and that is trust. Do you trust that they are good at what they do just as they're trusting that you're good at what you do? Is it an equal partnership where both parties are viewed as bringing equal value? Have you taken the time to get to know each other, your interests, your strengths, your backgrounds, and do you challenge each other? Do you each try to push your boundaries to get better at what you do? Leverage the outside perspective. So having a designer come into your project without knowing the technical details or project history is not a disadvantage at all. In fact, it's a distinct advantage. If your designer doesn't understand something about your project, then it's a pretty good bet that the people that are the other side of that barrier that this piece is going to aren't going to understand it either. We designers see your projects through the very eyes of the people that you're trying to communicate to, so use it to your advantage. And finally, embrace a process of discovery. So if you approach visual design as the process of just making something pretty, that's exactly what you're going to end up with, is information that's maybe prettier but no more understandable or clear or engaging. On the other hand, if you approach it as a process of discovery and allow your designer to dig into your project, explore, get curious, they will not only exceed your expectations with the results, but they're also going to be able to help you translate that information in a way that you, being an inhabitant of that project bubble, may not have been able to imagine. So let your designer help you identify those gaps and those opportunities in the graphic and see your project in a different light. So one of my favorite projects that I've done at HDR sticks out in my mind precisely because it hit all 4 of those 4 points. A few years ago now, a project manager came up to me and asked me, or kind of presented me with a challenge, I guess. He said, can you fit 225 pages into 4? And that's exactly the kind of challenge I lived for. So I was like, yes, I will. And the project was for the Iowa DOT. They were looking at modernizing their increasingly old and outdated lock and dam system on the upper Mississippi River. Our technical staff at HDR had conducted a study and ended up with a 225-page document that outlined the past, the present, and the possible future of this system. And the Iowa DOT wanted to get this study in front of legislators and other agencies, but they realized very wisely that if you throw a 225-page densely technical study at very busy often non-technical people that you weren't going to get very far. They wanted to create a condensed visual infographic summary that would get everybody up to the same baseline of understanding and, more importantly, hopefully compel them to support the project. So when working with me, the project manager here at HGR, instead of trying to dictate every piece, only outlined the goals, gave me the data, and just trusted me to do my job and allowed me to discover the information in the report on my own. He deliberately leveraged my outside perspective, which was really cool, fun for me, and I think it ended up with a better result. So here's the first page of the summary, and then we can move to the middle here. And one thing of note on the left side, that graph which shows the relationship between the delay hours and the tonnage going through each lock and dam on the upper Mississippi is something that wasn't in the report at all, but as I was reading it from an outsider, was able to identify that this would be a really cool thing to show the discrepancy between some locks and dams having a lot more delays and less tonnage than they should, to show some of that balance being off. So that's a great example of allowing your designer to kind of discover the information on their own. And finally, the back side. So the end result of this is that it got printed and distributed to legislators and other DOTs and other agencies around. And what was really cool is everybody responded really well to it. Everybody understood the project quickly on the challenges of the project, the importance of it. And the Iowa DOT was able to secure 4 other state partnerships on this project to get more of a coalition going together and move some of the legislation forward. So it was really successful, and then here at HGR, this has been kind of almost like a wake-up call to a lot of our project managers. Is to, yes, you know, your technical report is extremely important. I'm sure it's very well done, and we do need that to exist. But these visual summaries can really help everybody jump in on your project and see what you're doing quickly, and then dig into the report as they need to. So information designers can take or it really can help you develop and sketch out a concept and then polish it into something that is clean and engaging and readable, like this schematic explaining what a watershed district does. We can take text-heavy reports and transform them into bright visual summaries like this Watershed District Annual Report Summary. We can take kind of dry standard tables and make them into instantly readable and a lot more fun graphics like these in data, or I guess in-document graphic visualizations for a corridor down in Arizona. Here's another one showing travel time. We could take kind of notebook scribbles and convert them into rich user experiences like this trail and destination guide for Greenlee County, Arizona. We can take dull, you know, kind of standard documentations and convert them into much more readable, much more user-friendly guides. We can take kind of dry lists of statistics and create more visually compelling infographics. We could take your word smart art and turn them into something that is much more professional and polished and really messages your story and tells the story of something in a much better way. Here's the backside to that. And information doesn't have to be static, of course. I'm showing a lot of static things, but I'm also a web developer, and I also work with a lot of people who do videos, so I'm going to show a few websites and videos. This is a compilation of a whole bunch, what you're seeing is a whole bunch of financial and construction progress reports that were written by various technical staff, and Iowa DOT wanted to take this for their Council Bluffs improvement project and create an interactive online annual progress report, which resulted in this, and I'll let it play for just a minute and then I'll move on. This is something that's online and accessible right now, and it walks through all that information that you just saw in a much more friendly way. It kind of takes out the highlights, allows people to click around, take a map tour of the project, see where the status is at, dig into each individual project and see details, etc. And it's a sort of scrolling website that goes down, and of course it compresses down to a mobile device quite nicely as well. We can take kind of your big environmental documents and turn them into concepts at first. So this is a storyboard for a website based off of this environmental document. The storyboard or a wireframe, I guess is a better way to put it, of the home page. And finally, the resulting website here, which really helps tell the story of this water supply project in North Carolina. Why is it important? What are we doing about it? Let's walk through the EIS document. And finally, video is extremely popular right now, and video is an incredibly powerful way to get something that is complicated across quickly, because you employ not only visuals but also audio and motion to describe a concept. So what you're looking at here is sort of a technical schematic of movable barriers for a roadway construction project. So I'm not even going to explain what they are. I guess I'll let you watch the video. So we kind of took this idea, we storyboarded it out, made a script, kind of sketched out what we wanted to do, and ended up with this video. And I'm not sure if sound is audible. It is for me, and it might not be audible for you. But this video, in case it's not audible for you, is a video showing what movable barriers are and what to expect on a large construction project here in Minneapolis on a freeway. So, Drew, can you guys hear the audio?
I hear something. Angie says she can hear it. Gina says she doesn't.
Well, then I'm just interrupting by talking. Okay. Well,
Very
this is I'll cut it off because I can't hear myself talk with the audio. So that's really the last thing I wanted to show you. Video has been a really popular thing for us here at HDR, and we have several centers around the country that do video, and we've really been kicking out a lot of really great videos. That's a great way to visualize a concept. So if you have one thing that you take away from this presentation, really, from everything that I've shown you, is that I hope you've kind of got an appreciation for how powerful visual design can be in creating an engaged understanding about your project in the communities that you're working with. The brain is a beautiful machine. It's a visual processing powerhouse, and it's really our secret weapon in connecting our projects to the people that they're for. So at this point, I don't know, Drew, if you usually do questions. I'm happy to just have people email me if we're over time, or maybe no one has questions.
Well, we actually budget. Well, we actually budget to go to about 12:15. Well, quarter past the hour. So if anybody, yeah, if anybody wants to stick around, that is. I got a question that I think some others might be asking too, and that's, you talk about calling in a designer to do this, and we looked at putting together the video. Those both sound like they might be beyond the resources of some P2 practitioners, and they're trying to put a project together. Maybe they've got, as I say, limited resources. Is there something out there? Is there a way that they can get an idea of how to render something into something visual? Is there a way that, is there a tool that can help them build these, build their videos or their graphic representations?
Well, that's a really good question, because I know that that's a challenge, and it's a challenge for us too. On some projects, there just isn't a lot of room for doing things, and really, you know, I've shown a lot of very extensive, complicated graphics, and yes, those are awesome and great, but really just taking some effort, if it's a project that has documentation, taking some effort to lay out that document in a way that's a little bit more readable, writing your content in a way that is much more sort of conversational and plain language. Those are smaller ways, and little visualizations, like even just simple bars and charts, images, white space is really important. Let the brain breathe. Don't cram as much as you can on a page. Like, those little things don't cost anymore. They just are a different way of approaching it, and they can really help without a designer at all. Now, there are programs out there. I mean, I think there's Microsoft Publisher. There's a whiteboard video. Oh, what is it called? Like LightScribe or something. There are services out there that can help people who aren't, you know, motion graphic artists or designers sort of put different media together. You know, you're going to end up with a more generic look, and you're going to have less control over the output, which I think can be expected. If you're using a service, I'm sorry, I wish I could remember the name. It might be VideoScribe, where there are some services out there where non-technical people, although it very much helps to have a background in it to put things together. As far as doing design, doing more intricate design is very difficult without design software. But, you know, PowerPoint is surprisingly versatile. So if you kind of look around, Information is Beautiful is a great site to get inspiration from. Behance, ANCE is a great site to get inspiration from. And then also National Geographic, New York Times, and the Washington Post are the three top, in my opinion, sort of journalistic outputs of really great graphics that take a lot of information and condense it down. If you spend a little bit of time just personally looking at sort of those sorts of things and getting into your head how things can be visualized, then you're going to approach your projects differently and be able to do some of that to some level, even without a designer.
Yeah, and those ones you mentioned, they are good at that too. Angie, in fact, was asking that very question about sites for inspiration and that sort of thing, so I think you've covered that one. Carla is asking if you got any tips on deciding when you would educate on the technical language versus using plain language. So if I understand that question right, when you would use the technical language and then explain it versus using plain language.
Yeah, that's a really good question because you don't want to do a blanket approach to everything. So one of the first questions I ask if someone comes up to me and says, in fact, this just happened this week, they had this economic impacts report of some sort of roadway project in, I obviously didn't read this report very closely yet. It's in a state that is not mine. But one of the first questions I asked is, who is this going to and what's the point? Like, what do you want to get out of it? And the answer to those two questions helps determine what kind of level you use in terms of language. So if it's going out to the public, you really have to try to make an effort to use plain language. And that does not mean dumb it down. That is very important. You don't, just because someone doesn't maybe understand the type of project you're doing doesn't mean they're dumb. It just means that they don't have that context in order to understand it. So don't write it to the 5th grade level. I hear people say that all the time, and I find it really insulting because this could come, I mean, I could be on the receiving end of this communications piece. I live in a neighborhood somewhere, and I don't want to be written to like I'm a 5th grader. I just want to be written to like, I don't happen to do this type of construction work, and please explain to me what this is. So it just means write it like you're writing it to one of your friends that isn't in your industry. If they can't understand it, then someone else isn't going to be able to understand it. However, if the answer to that is maybe it's going to people within an organization, they're going to have a higher level of understanding of that particular project type, and then you can kind of step up your technical language and deal in nuances a little bit more because their baseline understanding is just going to be higher than the public because they're within a certain, you know, circle of knowledge at that point. So we will adjust our language based on who the audience is and also what the point is. So if the point is just an introduction to a project, that's a great, you know, you want your language to be very well clear and well written and plain, I guess is the word we're using now for that kind of project. But if you're trying to explain, you're doing something a little bit more specific and explaining maybe a technical process. So an example that we have to explain a lot is CIPP lining for sewer pipes, like what that is. Well, your technical language just by necessity is going to be a little bit more complex because if you break it down too far, you start to just be inaccurate. So that's the two questions I ask, and I base what I do off of those answers.
And Angie is asking the other one. She wants to know what your sources of inspiration are.
Everything. I'm addicted to my phone and my iPad, and this is my hobby, which I'm like feel embarrassed that I'm admitting that, but this really is my hobby, and I hope
your boss isn't listening.
I know. I should. Is this being recorded? Maybe I'll send it to her. I look at things all the time, and the ones that I mentioned, I always. I'm a National Geographic subscriber. I love the articles, but really I love the visualizations and I love maps. So that's a great place. Washington Post I follow. New York Times I follow. Washington Post specifically has a graphics-only Twitter handle that you can follow just their graphics, so I follow that. Behance is an online portfolio site for other designers, as is, I think, Dribbble is another one of those. So just designers putting their work up, and they're always very good. Information is Beautiful is another one I look at. They have annual awards for the best data visualizations every year, and so I will go comb through those when I find time. And then I'm a Twitter user, not so much a make content. I don't make a lot of content. I'll retweet, but I follow a lot of designers, and I do that. I started out by Googling what are the best web designers to follow, what are the best designers to follow, or whatever, and there's lists out there where you start with those people, and then eventually they're retweeting things, and then you're following that person that they retweeted, and you end up with kind of a good content feed tailored to your specific wants. I also use Feedly and Flipboard, and I sign up for different design content feeds. So I'll go through Feedly and Flipboard probably once a week and run through all the new posts and see if anything catches my eye. So that's what I do.
All right. And a word from Angie. She says, awesome, thank you. And awesome and thank you, I think, are the words from me right now, because I don't see any further questions out there. So
Great.
Now's a great time to say thank you, Kelly, for sharing this with us. And once again, we'll have this recording online. If you've got any collateral stuff, any material that you can make available to us as well, can we have your PowerPoint deck in some way?
You can. The problem with the PowerPoint is there's a lot of videos in it, and it's a large file, so it isn't actually the best thing to send around because of that. So I have like a Google link I can share. It's just huge.
Sounds good.
So
yeah,
that's that.
The link will be fine. And yeah, so thank you very much for all of this. Thank you all for taking part here. And we're going to wrap this up. Coming up next month on our IAP2 webinar, it's the changing face of Indigenous engagement. We're going to welcome Bob Joseph, founder of Indigenous Corporate Training, and Anne Harding, Aboriginal Engagement Specialist at Suncor, and not incidentally, immediate past president of IAP2 Canada. They're going to be looking at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons and see how that aligns with IAP2 principles and vice versa. So that's coming up Tuesday, July 12th at the usual time, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific, and visit your respective IAP2 affiliate website to sign up. Also, please remember the IAP2 North American Conference coming up in Montreal. Spread the word. Follow us on Twitter. Follow that hashtag I told you about before. It's IAP2MTL16. And tell your colleagues and those just plain interested. It's a great one. We've got some great sessions coming up, and we'll be sending you e-blasts about those sessions in the next few weeks to come. So once again, Kelly, thank you very much for sharing with us today.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for taking part. We will talk to you again on July the 12th. Hope to see you then. Bye-bye now.